There are reports that have been brought out, which was also published by a commission that was instituted by the president of the ANC, the then president of the ANC, Comrade Oliver Reginald Tambo. Those reports are part of what is known as the O'Malley archive documents, and anyone who wants to Google those reports can read them. The report says there is a clique inside the country, led by Pravin Gordhan, by Murphy Murobe, by Cyril Ramaphosa, who we can call a cabal. It's there. The reports are available, and it was actually delivered by the then president of the ANC, Comrade Oliver Reginald Tambo, saying those people are trying to manipulate what happens in our liberation struggle. Because now that cabal has managed to take control of the African National Congress through the election, or the manipulation of the election, corruptly so, of Cyril Ramaphosa. And if you read those reports that were released by Comrade Oliver Tambo, he identifies, that report fingers Pravin Gordhan as one of the worst members of the cabal and one of the most dangerous people in terms of destroying the liberation project. If you look at who were allowed to go and visit Nelson Mandela in prison at Victor Verster, it was Cyril Ramaphosa, it was Murphy Murobe, it was Pravin Gordhan. Those who are fingered in that report that I've referred to earlier as being part of that cabal. So there you find President Nelson Mandela is coming out of prison. He's suddenly released. Who is there to meet him at the gates of Victor Verster? Cyril Ramaphosa. Here's the first one to shake his hand. Here's the one who gets into the car with him. Here's the one who goes with him to the parade in Cape Town, at the City Hall in Cape Town, stand on that balcony and actually hold the mic for him to speak. They immediately insert themselves right there. The dynamics were very difficult. You must also not forget that there were other influences coming to play on President Nelson Mandela. The Menels, Clive and Irene Menel, the owners of the second largest mining enterprise in South Africa, Angloval, who would say to Mandela, we will give money to the ANC. We will assist you and others to be able to resettle yourselves. Well, the NEC is the decision-making body of the African National Congress, which is elected every 5 years at a conference of the ANC, which is known as the National Conferences of the ANC. It is a body of 80 people who are elected at that national conference to lead the African National Congress. And the leader of that NEC is the president. In this instance, it is Cyril Ramaphosa, who was elected as president at the 54th National Conference at Nasrec. But this NEC, which is there to implement the policy decisions, the resolutions that were taken, which said that the land must be expropriated without compensation, that the South African Reserve Bank must be nationalized, that we must create a state bank, that we must transform our financial institutions in such a way that they will make finances available for the empowerment of young Black and especially African entrepreneurs. None of those resolutions were implemented because Cyril Ramaphosa and this NEC are not interested in serving the interests of the majority of Black and especially African people. I've been standing during the last couple of NEC meetings with a poster outside those meetings saying Ramaphosa must go. But instead of them listening to that message, instead of those comrades, some of them with whom I've worked for many, many decades. I joined when I was 19. In a couple of days' time, I'm going to turn 63. I've pleaded with them, comrades, please, you can see that Cyril Ramaphosa is destroying the ANC. Please remove him as president of the ANC. They failed to do so. And part of the reason why they failed to do so is because all of them have become compromised. All of them have taken money from Ramaphosa and from those companies that support him. So they cannot even open their mouths. They cannot even show a little bit of backbone to stand up, to act, to save the ANC. And that's why I've said to you, the ANC is in deep crisis because the African National Congress has played such a central role in the liberation of our country. If we look at what the ideals of the ANC was when it was formed in 1912, in January 1912 at the Vaiuk Methodist Church in Mangaung, the ideals was for the return of the land to the people, the full empowerment of African people to be part of this economy and to be able to scale the commanding heights of this economy. So if the ANC fails, as the oldest liberation movement in Africa, which inspired many of the other liberation movements on the African continent that brought liberation against the colonial powers in those other African nations, it is a massive blow for Africa, and it is a massive blow for the liberation ideals and hopes of our people. Look, I don't think it is as much a conflict between the South African nation inside the country and those who left the country and worked in the ANC and in Umkhonto we Sizwe in exile. But a small clique inside the country who were part of the United Democratic Front, of leaders who wanted to control and manipulate what was going on in the liberation struggle and especially inside the country. And those people were known as the Cabal. There are reports that have been brought out, which was also published by a commission that was instituted by the president of the ANC, the then president of the ANC, Comrade Oliver Reginald Tambo. Those reports are part of what is known as the O'Malley archive documents. And anyone who wants to Google those reports can read them. The report says there is a clique inside the country, led by Pravin Gordhan, by Murphy Murobe, by Cyril Ramaphosa, who we can call a cabal. It's there. The reports are available, and it was actually delivered by the then president of the ANC, Comrade Oliver Reginald Tambo, saying those people are trying to manipulate what happens in our liberation struggle. And that is the division that you are referring to. And that is the problem that we are faced with inside South Africa today. Because now that cabal has managed to take control of the African National Congress through the election or the manipulation of the election, corruptly so, of Cyril Ramaphosa at the 54th National Conference. And you know the insidious role that Pravin Gordhan plays in our South African politics, the way in which he is destroying our state-owned enterprises. And if you read those reports that were released by Comrade Oliver Tambo, he identifies, that report fingers Pravin Gordhan as one of the worst members of the cabal and one of the most dangerous people in terms of destroying the liberation project in South Africa. So we have seen a terrible shift away from the true commitment to liberation to those people who were part of that cabal. And that cabal equals people who've sold out, who made common cause with white monopoly capitalism and with imperialism, and who today are selling our nation to the Western imperialist powers. Because remember, the ANC had always operated as a so-called broad church. So it included a variety of different groups and people. And during the time that this cabal started coming to the fore, was exactly also that same period when the ANC was now moving from exile back into South Africa and was being unbanned. So there was a lot of contestation going on inside the African National Congress. The person who I believe could have taken the strong, decisive decisions about this was Comrade O.R Tambo. But sadly, and this was a big tragedy for the ANC, just as we were going through this time of moving from exile back into the country, the unbanning of the ANC, when we entered this very, very complicated, difficult period of negotiations, Comrade O.R Tambo had two massive strokes, which debilitated him, which made it impossible for him to be able to play the role that he could have played in controlling these things. He was on top of his game. There was no better president that we ever had in the history of the ANC but O.R Tambo. Then President Mandela came out, and I do not want to blame him, I do not want to be unfair to him, but he was for 27 years inside prison. He was removed from all these dynamics. Suddenly he was thrust forward into this very complicated world, into all these infightings also going on within the National Democratic Revolution and movement in South Africa. You can't blame Nelson Mandela for not knowing what all these dynamics were. And remember, he was sitting in prison, even at Victor Verster. The ANC leadership in exile couldn't yet enter the country, engage with him. The people who were able and allowed, and I think deliberately allowed to do so, by the apartheid regime to go and talk to him there at the house at Victor Verster prison, where he was kept for the last part of his imprisonment, were exactly these guys from the cabal. If you look at who were allowed to go and visit Nelson Mandela in prison at Victor Verster, it was Cyril Ramaphosa, it was Murphy Murobe, it was Pravin Gordhan. Those who are fingered in that report that I've referred to earlier as being part of that cabal. So there you find President Nelson Mandela is coming out of prison. He's suddenly released. Who is there to meet him at the gates of Victor Verster? Cyril Ramaphosa. Here's the first one to shake his hand. Here's the one who gets into the car with him. Here's the one who goes with him to the parade in Cape Town, at the City Hall in Cape Town, stand on that balcony and actually hold the mic for him to speak. They immediately insert themselves right there. The dynamics were very difficult. You must also not forget that there were other influences coming to play on President Nelson Mandela. There were people who were coming to the fore from white monopoly capitalism in South Africa, amongst them the Menels, Clive and Irene Menel, the owners of the second largest mining enterprise in South Africa, Angloval, who would say to Mandela, we will give money to the ANC. We will assist you and others to be able to resettle yourselves in South Africa because you come out of prison, you've got no money. Those who come from exile, they've got no money. We will give you money. We will help you. We forget that it was the Menels who paid the education for President Nelson Mandela's two daughters, Zenani and Zinzi Mandela, to go to school. It was the Menels who helped to sustain President Mandela's family while he was in prison. These people had a long-term plan. They knew that those monies which they invested in assisting these families was an investment on having influence and control over these comrades in the future once the negotiations would start. And it played out exactly like that. We know that the Menels were central in suggesting to President Mandela that Cyril Ramaphosa should be brought into the senior leadership of the ANC. In fact, it was them who said to President Mandela, we think Cyril Ramaphosa will be a good Secretary General of the ANC. And President Mandela, having listened to them, having met Cyril Ramaphosa as soon as he came out of prison, one of the first people he engaged with, he pushed him to become in 1991 at the first legal conference of the ANC in June 1991 in Durban, for Ramaphosa to become the Secretary General of the ANC. It was an anomaly. Ramaphosa was a Johnny-come-lately. He was not even part of the senior leadership of the ANC, but yet he was parachuted in, also through the power and influence that Mandela so amply had, pushed him to the fore for Ramaphosa to become the Secretary General of the ANC. And once he was Secretary General of the ANC, he then started to extend his control over the National Executive Committee of the ANC. He then started to bring his own people in to be part of the various committees of the ANC. Remember, the negotiations started with Thabo Mbeki as being the chief negotiator, and Jacob Zuma being the head of intelligence. When both Jacob Zuma and Thabo Mbeki were outside the country, actually traveling with President Nelson Mandela, Ramaphosa called a meeting of the National Executive. He used those friends and cronies of his who he had brought into the NEC to pull off a coup. They removed Thabo Mbeki as the chief negotiator for the CODESA negotiations. They removed Jacob Zuma as the head of intelligence. And Ramaphosa imposed himself as the head of negotiations from hence on. That was always the plan. And that plan unfolded beautifully for them once he managed to pull off that coup in the National Executive Committee of the ANC. And then he formed a very, very close, insidious relationship with the chief negotiator of the National Party, Rolf Meyer. And between the two of them, they made the secret deals, they made the arrangements behind the scenes, and then they came and presented those deals, those arrangements in the public domain of CODESA. They manipulated the situation, and eventually we ended up with this deeply flawed constitution that we have today, with a negotiating process that granted the sunset clauses, which meant that the white apartheid apparatchiks, those who were part of the government of the old apartheid regime, had their jobs secured. That is what the sunset clauses meant. It also included in the Constitution a clause that gave property rights, guaranteed property rights. Now, how on earth do you guarantee property rights in a country where you know the colonial history of this country is that white colonists came to South Africa and stole the land from the indigenous people? But you go and introduce a property rights clause in the Constitution that now cements, secures those stolen properties as a right for those white colonists. And that is the kind of sellout project that I keep on talking about. And interestingly enough, today, after all these years, that relationship between Cyril Ramaphosa and Rolf Meyer still continues. And Rolf Meyer today has been appointed by Cyril Ramaphosa as one of his special advisors to the President of South Africa. Can you imagine someone who was an apartheid agent, who at one stage was the Minister of Defense under the apartheid regime, who was part of the apartheid regime's State Security Council that took decisions to attack the ANC in the neighboring countries in Southern Africa, who was part of those decisions to fight the wars in Angola, to fight the ANC in Lusaka and attack the ANC in Lusaka, in Lesotho and in Botswana. That same man that same apartheid apparatchik, who was part of the crime against humanity, has been made by this president, Cyril Ramaphosa, his special advisor. It cannot get worse than that.